Hello there. I hope you're doing great. Today, I'm taking you on another chilling adventure. When you're ready, buckle up and let's go. The fog was unnatural that night. It clung to the streets like a living thing, tendrils of white mist curling around the bases of gas lamps and licking at the edges of the cobblestones. London's usual nocturnal hum, distant traffic, murmurs of late-night revelers, the occasional bark of a dog, had vanished. The city felt abandoned, as though it were holding its breath. Victoria Hargrave pulled her scarf tighter against the chill and quickened her pace. Her flat in Bloomsbury was only a short walk from her office, but tonight the street stretched endlessly, unfamiliar twists and turns disrupting her usual route. It had been a long evening. Her job as an editor at Harper & Sons often demanded late nights, but this was the latest she had ever stayed. She'd been working on a manuscript, a peculiar submission from a reclusive author. The story was vivid, even grotesque, describing shadowy creatures that haunted the streets of a fog-shrouded city, preying on those who walk alone at night. It was fiction, of course, but something about the manuscript lingered with her, an uncomfortable familiarity in the descriptions, a gnawing sense that it wasn't just a story. Victoria pushed the thought aside. She wasn't about to let a book rattle her nerves. The author had probably based the setting on London's infamous fogs, nothing more. Still, the unease gnawed at her as she walked. She turned down an alley to shortcut through Tavistock Square, her boots clicking softly the damp cobblestones. It was here, halfway down the alley, that she first felt it, a strange heaviness in the air, a pressure that made her skin prickle. She paused, the instinctive fear rising in her chest. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, measured, and perfectly in time with her own. Victoria froze. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the alley behind her. It was empty, but the fog seemed thicker now, an oppressive wall pressing against the brick walls of the narrow passage. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The fog swallowed her words. There was no response, no sound, only the steady pounding of her heart. She stood there for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat, before forcing herself to move. "It's just your imagination," she whispered. "Keep walking." But the footsteps resumed. They were louder now, distinct against the muffled silence of the city, and they were no longer in time with hers. Someone, or something, was following her. Victoria broke into a run, her heels clacking against the uneven stones. She didn't dare look back. Tavistock Square was just ahead, its iron gates barely visible through the haze. If she could make it there, maybe she could lose whoever, or whatever, was chasing her. She stumbled into the square, her breath ragged. The fog hung lower her, pooling around the roots of the skeletal trees like liquid smoke. The street lamps barely pierced the gloom, their halos faint and distorted. She stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a bench. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was too quiet, as though the world had gone completely still. "Why are you here?" The voice came from behind guttural, deep, each word dripping with malice. Victoria spun around, her eyes wide. Standing at the edge of the square was a figure, a man, or at least something shaped like one. He was tall, impossibly so, his lanky frame cloaked in a black coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but as he stepped closer, she realized with growing horror that he didn't have a face at all. Where his features should have been, there was only a blank, rippling void, like the surface of a still pond disturbed by unseen hands. "Why you're here?" the figure repeated, its voice echoing unnaturally. I live here." Victoria stammered, stepping back. "Helly, I didn't mean to. You saw too much." She didn't know what it meant, but the word sent a cold spike of terror through her. The figure moved closer, its motions unnervingly smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking. Victoria turned and ran, weaving through the fog-shrouded trees. She could feel it behind her, its presence oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She could hear it now. Not footsteps, but a strange, wet rustling, as though it dragged itself through the air. The square seemed to stretch on forever, the gates she'd entered through now nowhere in sight. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the world around her. The street lamps flickered and went out, one by one, until only darkness remained. Then she saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, identical to the first. They surrounded her, their blank faces turning toward her in unison. Victoria backed away, her breath coming in shallow gaps. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "He don't understand. You are not meant to see." The first figure rasped, stepping forward. Its long, bony hand reached out, fingers ending in sharp, black points, voice trembling. Victoria stumbled, falling to the ground. She scrambled back, her hands scraping against the rough cobblestones. The figures closed in, their voices overlapping in a sinister chorus. "She saw us. Her does not belong. She must become one of us." Victoria stumbled through the fog-shrouded streets, her mind spiraling into panic. The faceless figures were everywhere now, appearing from the mist in every direction. They didn't run. They didn't have to. Their slow, gliding movements seemed designed to toy with her, like a predator letting its prey exhaust itself. Her lungs burned as she ran, each breath a ragged gasp. The city itself seemed to warp and twist, her voice trembling. Streets looping back on themselves, buildings leaning at impossible angles. She could feel the weight of their presence pressing against her back, hear the whispers that slithered through her thoughts. "Why are you run, Eve? You cannot leave, our hours now." Finally, she reached a church. Its spire pierced the fog like a blade, and the faint glow of candles flickered through the stained glass windows. Desperate, Victoria pushed through the heavy wooden doors and collapsed onto the stone floor. The silence inside was deafening. The air was colder here, thick with the scent of wax and mildew. She pulled herself up and turned to bolt the door behind her, voice trembling. But when she looked, the street beyond the threshold was gone. The door now opened onto a black void, swirling with the same rippling nothingness that formed the figures' faces. She slammed the door shut and pressed her back against it, tears streaming down her face. The church was empty. Rows of pews stretching into darkness, the altar barely visible in the dim candlelight. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. A faint sound answered her. A low, rhythmic thud, like the beating of a colossal heart. It came from the direction of the altar. Victoria hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay away, but something pulled her forward. The pounding grew louder as she approached, echoing through the cavernous space. When she reached the altar, she saw it. At first, she thought it was a statue, but the thing before it was alive. A grotesque, towering figure loomed above the altar, its body a mass of shadows and writhing tendrils. Dozens of faceless heads emerged from its form, each one turning toward her in airy unison. "You have come home," the creature said, its voice a symphony of whispers that filled the air. Victoria stumbled back, shaking her head. "No, this isn't be real. It can't." The heads tilted, their blank voids focusing on her. "You have seen us. You belong to us. Your face is ours now." And she reached up, her hands trembling, and touched her own face. Her fingers sank into the smooth, featureless surface as though it were made of liquid. Her scream echoed through the church as her features began to dissolve, pulled into the void of her hands. The creature's tendrils reached out, wrapping around her arms, her legs, her throat. She felt herself being lifted into the air, her body weightless, her mind unraveling. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her own face, floating among the dozens of others, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. Victoria woke again, but this time it was different there, curling around her like a shroud, but she no longer felt fear. She stood in the middle of Tavistock Square, the city silent and empty around her. She turned, her movements slow and deliberate. In the distance she saw another lone figure, walking through the fog. A young man in a business suit, his briefcase clutched tightly, his eyes darting nervously. She smiled. Or she would have, if she still had a mouth. He stopped when he saw her, his face painted her blank visage. He backed away, muttering, "This can't be real." No, Victoria tilted her head, her movements fluid and unnatural. Her voice was a whisper, low and hollow. "Why are you here?" And the man screamed and ran, disappearing didn't case him. She didn't have to. He would find his way back to her eventually. Some always were in the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, and many. The others were coming. They always came, disappeared into the mist. Another faceless shadow lost in the endless fog, and the city of London remained silent, shrouded in secrets that no one dared to see. Thank you for coming on this adventure with me. If you made it this far, then try to guess the spooky riddle you'll find in the comments, and also leave a ghost emoji down below. If you enjoyed this journey, then you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and check out also other scary stories in this channel. Take care and see you in our next journey.